the president does choose to implement any tariffs against Canada, we're ready with a response.
Imagine waking up to find out that one of America's biggest trade partners just pulled the plug on vital energy exports, leaving the U.S. economy hanging in the balance. This isn't just speculation. Canada just made a move that could send shockwaves through the U.S., and even President Donald Trump didn't see it coming. This could trigger blackouts, skyrocketing fuel costs, and a trade war unlike anything we've seen before. So what led to this crisis? How did tensions between the U.S. and Canada spiral out of control? And what happens next as Trump scrambles for a response? Stick around because the fallout from this trade war could affect you forever. What's happening? Energy is more than just a commodity. It is a strategic asset that can shape economies and influence geopolitics. For decades, the United States has depended on Canadian electricity to power key states such as New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. These states receive a significant portion of their imported electricity from Canada, particularly from Ontario's extensive hydroelectric grid. However, this relationship is now under threat in response to President Donald Trump's aggressive trade policies, including steep tariffs on Canadian goods. Canadian leaders have signaled a willingness to reduce or completely halt electricity exports to the United States. This move is not merely symbolic. It has the potential to cause widespread instability in the American energy market. Given that states such as Michigan rely on Canada for nearly all their imported electricity, any disruption could lead to increased energy costs and potential blackouts during peak demand periods. For businesses and consumers alike, this could mean higher electricity bills, unpredictable power supply, and long-term uncertainty. Industries that require a stable and affordable energy supply, such as manufacturing and technology, could see increased operational costs, leading to higher prices for goods and services. While the United States has energy resources of its own, replacing Canadian electricity on short notice would be a logistical challenge. Building additional power infrastructure, sourcing alternative suppliers, or ramping up domestic production would take years and require significant investment. In the short term, states affected by these cuts would likely have to rely on expensive emergency power sources, further straining local economies. The message from Canada is clear. Energy dependence is a two-way street. While the United States has used economic policies to pressure Canada, the northern neighbor holds leverage in the form of crucial energy supplies. This situation exposes the vulnerabilities in the U.S. energy grid and raises questions about the long-term stability of North American energy cooperation. But electricity is just one piece of the puzzle. Oil plays an even bigger role in this high-stakes standoff. Oil as a political lever. If electricity is Canada's first economic weapon, oil is its second, and arguably the most powerful. The United States depends on Canada for more than half of its crude oil imports, making Canada the single largest supplier of foreign oil to the U.S. refining hubs across the Midwest and Gulf Coast, process millions of barrels of Canadian crude each day, fueling everything from transportation to heavy industry. However, the growing trade tensions have led Canadian officials to consider a drastic measure, restricting oil exports to the United States. This would not only disrupt the flow of energy, but also send shockwaves through the global oil market. The potential consequences would be severe: higher gas prices, increased transportation costs, and supply shortages for industries reliant on petroleum-based products. One of the biggest concerns is that American refineries are designed specifically to process Canadian heavy crude. If this supply were to be cut or reduced, these facilities would struggle to find alternative sources of comparable quality. Switching to other suppliers, such as those in the Middle East, would take time and could lead to increased refining costs. Beyond the immediate impact on fuel prices, the broader economic effects of such a move would be significant. The United States transportation sector, including airlines, shipping, and trucking, would face rising fuel expenses, which would inevitably be passed down to consumers. Additionally, industries reliant on oil byproducts, such as plastics and chemicals, would see increased material costs, driving up prices for everyday goods. Canada is already exploring alternative markets for its oil. The expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which connects Alberta's oil fields to the Pacific coast, allows Canada to export more crude to Asia, reducing its reliance on the United States as a primary buyer. If Canada prioritizes global markets over U.S. exports, American refineries may find themselves scrambling to secure stable supplies, leading to long-term price volatility. The threat of cutting oil exports is not just an economic maneuver. It is a direct challenge to U.S. energy security. It forces American policymakers to reconsider their approach to energy diplomacy and highlights the risks of an overly protectionist trade strategy. But this trade conflict is not limited to energy. Tariffs are escalating tensions across multiple industries. The tariff tug-of-war. The trade dispute between the United States and Canada has become a battle of tariffs, with both sides imposing heavy duties on key imports. The Trump administration has targeted Canadian steel, aluminum, and various consumer goods, arguing that these measures are necessary to protect American industries. In response, Canada has struck back with tariffs on U.S. products, affecting everything from agricultural exports to household appliances. The consequences of this tit-for-tat approach have been far-reaching. For consumers, the cost of everyday products has risen, as manufacturers pass on the expense of higher import taxes. Car prices, for example, have surged due to increased costs for steel and aluminum, while food prices have also been affected by tariffs on agricultural products. Businesses that depend on cross-border trade are feeling the strain as well. Automotive manufacturers, which operate complex supply chains spanning both countries, face higher production costs and potential delays. Canada's counter-tariffs on U.S. agricultural goods have left American farmers struggling to find new markets as demand for their products declines. This trade standoff has also increased market uncertainty, with investors wary of potential long-term economic fallout, as businesses postpone investments and expansion plans due to unpredictability in trade policies. Economic growth in both nations may slow. While tariffs are often used as negotiating tools, the escalation of this trade war raises concerns about long-term damage to the North American economy. If relations continue to deteriorate, businesses may begin restructuring their supply chains to reduce reliance on cross-border trade, further fragmenting what was once a highly integrated market. But trade disputes do not happen in isolation. When two of the world's largest economies clash, the ripple effects spread far beyond tariffs. Interconnected economies at risk. The United States and Canada share one of the most interconnected economic relationships in the world. Their supply chains, workforce, and markets are deeply entwined, making them highly vulnerable to disruptions caused by trade conflicts. Nowhere is this interdependence more evident than in the energy sector. The uncertainty surrounding energy trade is forcing businesses to reconsider their long-term strategies. Power companies are evaluating alternative sources of electricity, while refineries are exploring ways to diversify crude oil supply. But shifting away from Canada is neither quick nor cost-effective, meaning the U.S. will likely continue to feel the impact of strained relations for years to come. Beyond energy, industries across North America are grappling with the consequences of the trade war. Increased tariffs and supply chain disruptions are leading to higher costs for manufacturers, delays in production, and lower profit margins. This is particularly concerning for sectors such as automotive, aerospace, and agriculture, where U.S. and Canadian firms have long depended on seamless trade and cooperation. For the consumer, these disruptions manifest in higher prices for goods and services. Whether it is increased fuel costs, more expensive cars, or rising grocery bills, the effects of economic conflict are becoming increasingly tangible. The long-term risk is that businesses and governments may begin restructuring trade policies and supply chains in ways that permanently alter the economic landscape. Canada is already seeking new trade partners, while some U.S. businesses are looking for alternative suppliers outside North America. If this trend continues, the close economic ties between the U.S. and Canada could weaken, leading to a more fragmented and less efficient trade system. With energy, trade, and manufacturing all caught in the crossfire, the question remains: how much damage will this economic conflict cause before both nations decide to change course? The immediate impact on U.S. energy prices. Canada's decision to cut electricity and oil exports to the United States would send shockwaves through the American energy market. Northern states such as New York, Michigan, and Minnesota are particularly vulnerable, as they rely on Canadian imports for the majority of their electricity. Any disruption could trigger widespread power shortages and force energy providers to scramble for expensive alternatives. Electricity prices are already on the rise, but a sudden shortfall from Canada could push them even higher. Grid operators in the northern U.S. would be left with few choices. Either pass the cost on to consumers or reduce energy distribution, leading to potential blackouts during peak periods. Residents and businesses alike would feel the squeeze, as higher utility bills put additional strain on household budgets and operating expenses. The oil market is just as fragile. The United States imports over 3 million barrels of crude oil per day from Canada, making it the country's largest foreign supplier. A reduction in exports would force American refineries to seek crude from less stable regions such as the Middle East, leading to increased volatility in fuel prices. Gasoline and diesel costs could skyrocket, hitting consumers at the pump and driving up transportation costs across industries. Airlines, trucking companies, and logistics firms would face immediate financial strain, leading to price hikes on goods and services. This, in turn, would worsen inflation, further reducing the purchasing power of American consumers. In short, if Canada follows through on its energy export cuts, every aspect of the U.S. economy, from home electricity bills to grocery prices, could be impacted. And this economic fallout is putting political pressure on both governments, a crisis for both sides. As energy prices rise, manufacturing slows, and farmers struggle, political leaders in both Canada and the United States are facing mounting pressure to find solutions. In the U.S., state governors, business leaders, and trade organizations are sounding the alarm, warning that continued economic strain could lead to widespread discontent. Industries that once supported protectionist policies may begin to push back. Automakers, oil companies, and agricultural groups are lobbying against tariffs, urging the federal government to rethink its approach. If economic conditions worsen, these industries could shift their political support away from current policies, influencing future elections and policy decisions. On the Canadian side, the crisis is fueling a wave of economic nationalism. Political leaders are using the situation to rally support for greater self-sufficiency, calling for new trade agreements with Europe and Asia to reduce reliance on the U.S. market. If this sentiment continues to grow, it could mark a permanent shift in Canada's economic strategy, making it less dependent on American trade. The tension is also straining diplomatic relations. The once strong economic partnership between the two nations is being tested, and public trust on both sides is eroding. If leaders fail to find a resolution, it could lead to a long-term trade standoff that neither country can afford. For the United States, the stakes are especially high. Losing Canada as a key trade partner could mean permanent economic losses and a weaker position in global trade negotiations. Meanwhile, if Canada successfully builds stronger ties with alternative partners, the U.S. may find itself increasingly isolated. The big question remains: will political leaders find a way to de-escalate the situation, or will this trade war spiral out of control? Meanwhile, Canada isn't waiting around. It's looking for new trade partners, expanding trade with Europe and Asia. Canada is no longer relying solely on the United States as its primary trade partner. In the past decade, the country has actively strengthened its economic relationships with Europe and Asia, forging new trade agreements that could reshape its economic future. Deals such as the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership have given Canadian businesses more access to global markets. These agreements are more than just economic paperwork. They provide Canadian industries with new avenues for exporting key resources like oil, timber, and minerals, reducing the country's dependency on U.S. demand. The benefits of this shift are twofold. Canada gains leverage in global trade, and it minimizes the risks of economic disruption if tensions with the United States continue to rise. One of the biggest advantages of diversifying trade is the ability to sell to markets where demand is growing rapidly. Europe is seeking alternative energy sources to reduce reliance on Russian fuel, while Asian economies, particularly China and India, are expanding their industrial and technological sectors. Canada's ability to supply these markets with essential commodities puts it in a favorable position. If this trend continues, the balance of economic power in North America could shift significantly. And Canada's shift isn't just about trade, it's about energy independence too. New energy markets, the push for global oil exports. For decades, the United States has been the primary consumer of Canadian crude oil. However, as tensions over tariffs and trade policies escalate, Canada is looking beyond its southern neighbor and toward international markets. The expansion of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which allows oil to be exported to the Pacific coast, is a critical step in this transition. By increasing its oil exports to Asia and Europe, Canada is not just seeking profit but also strengthening its bargaining position. If more Canadian oil is directed overseas, the United States will have fewer sources of affordable crude. This could drive up prices for American consumers and force the U.S. to seek alternative, often more expensive energy sources. Global energy markets are shifting, and Canada is positioning itself as a key player. European nations struggling with energy shortages due to geopolitical conflicts are looking for new suppliers. At the same time, Asian nations are rapidly industrializing, increasing their energy demands. If Canada solidifies its role as a major energy supplier to these regions, its reliance on the United States could decrease dramatically. This move also has strategic implications. A diversified export portfolio means that Canada will be less vulnerable to U.S. political and economic pressures. In the past, American policies have had significant influence over Canadian energy exports. However, as Canada builds stronger relationships with international buyers, its economy becomes more resilient. And the energy shift isn't just about oil. Canada is eyeing new power markets too, diversifying electricity exports. Beyond oil, Canada is making major moves in the electricity sector. Historically, the country has supplied a significant portion of U.S. electricity demand, particularly in northeastern states like New York and Michigan. However, growing tensions and economic uncertainty have led Canadian policymakers to explore other options. One strategy involves redirecting electricity exports to domestic markets and international buyers. Canada has vast renewable energy resources, including hydroelectric, wind, and solar power, which could be sold to countries that are looking for clean energy alternatives. European nations, in particular, are searching for ways to cut emissions while securing reliable power sources. Investing in new energy infrastructure is another key element of Canada's strategy. By expanding and modernizing its power grid, the country can ensure that more of its energy production remains within its borders or is exported to partners outside of North America. This would give Canada greater control over its energy future, while reducing its dependence on U.S. buyers. For the United States, this shift poses serious challenges. Losing access to affordable Canadian electricity could result in higher energy costs, grid instability, and even power shortages. If American policymakers do not address these concerns soon, the U.S. could face long-term consequences that go beyond the immediate economic impact. But Canada isn't alone in this. Other nations are making similar moves. The rise of new economic alliances. Canada's efforts to diversify its trade and energy exports are part of a larger global trend. As U.S. policies become more protectionist, other countries are looking for alternative economic partnerships. Nations that once relied heavily on American trade are now forming their own alliances, reducing U.S. influence in global markets. Mexico, Canada's fellow partner in the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, has also started expanding its trade relationships. The country has signed new deals with China and South American nations, aiming to reduce its reliance on the United States. This shift could weaken the North American trade bloc, making it less of an economic powerhouse. In Europe, tensions with the United States have driven the European Union to strengthen ties with other global economies. The European Union has increased trade agreements with Asia and Latin America, creating a more interconnected global market that does not depend on U.S. participation. Perhaps the most significant challenge to U.S. economic dominance comes from China. The Chinese government has been quick to capitalize on trade tensions between the United States and its partners. By offering favorable trade agreements and investment opportunities, China has positioned itself as a viable alternative to American economic influence. If these global alliances continue to strengthen, the United States may find itself increasingly isolated. In an interconnected world, no single country can afford to operate without strong international partnerships. However, current U.S. policies risk pushing allies away rather than bringing them closer. And this isolation is becoming a growing trend as other nations follow Canada's lead. Canada's decision to expand trade and energy exports beyond the United States is not an isolated move. It is part of a larger shift in global economic power. As trade relationships evolve and new alliances form, the traditional dominance of the U.S. economy is being challenged. The consequences of this shift are profound. If Canada successfully reduces its reliance on the United States, it could pave the way for other nations to do the same. This could lead to a long-term decline in American influence, making it more difficult for the U.S. to dictate global economic policies. Mexico's growing trade independence. Mexico has been one of the United States' closest economic partners, deeply integrated through supply chains and trade agreements. However, recent years have seen a significant shift as Mexico seeks to reduce its economic dependence on the United States by expanding its trade relationships with other global powers. Its government has actively pursued stronger trade agreements with China, South America, and the European Union. The country has signed new investment deals with Chinese firms looking to expand their influence in Latin America, particularly in manufacturing and energy sectors. Additionally, Mexico's trade with South American countries, including Brazil and Argentina, has surged, diversifying its export destinations beyond the U.S. market. The growing trade diversification poses a significant challenge to U.S. influence in the region. For years, American policymakers have viewed Mexico as an essential economic and political ally. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which replaced the North American Free Trade Agreement, was intended to strengthen North American trade ties. But Mexico's outreach to new partners suggests that it is no longer willing to rely solely on U.S. trade. The shift is evident in Mexico's manufacturing sector. Many foreign automakers and technology firms are now investing in Mexico, not as a stepping stone to the U.S. market, but as a standalone manufacturing hub. With Mexico now serving as a key production base for European and Chinese companies, the United States risks losing a crucial economic advantage in its own backyard. If this trend continues, the United States may find itself with diminished economic leverage over its closest southern neighbor. A more independent Mexico could mean fewer U.S. exports heading south and a reduced ability for Washington to shape regional trade policies. But the trade shift isn't limited to North America. Europe is making moves too. Europe's shift away from U.S. trade. The European Union has been steadily reducing its reliance on U.S. trade, forging stronger ties with countries like China, Canada, and Japan. In response to U.S. tariffs on European goods, particularly steel, aluminum, and automobiles, the European Union has aggressively sought alternative trade routes to avoid economic dependence on the American market. One of the most significant developments is the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between the European Union and Canada. This agreement has facilitated a massive increase in trade between the two regions, allowing European businesses to bypass U.S. tariffs and access North American markets without going through the United States. Additionally, the European Union-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment aims to expand business opportunities between Europe and China, strengthening economic ties between the two global powers. The shift away from U.S. trade policies has also been evident in the automotive and technology industries. European car manufacturers, once heavily reliant on the U.S. market, are now prioritizing exports to Asia and Latin America. Meanwhile, European technology firms are forming partnerships with Asian semiconductor manufacturers, reducing their dependence on U.S. tech exports. By expanding these partnerships, the European Union is not only safeguarding its economic stability, but also reducing the United States' influence in global trade negotiations. The more Europe moves away from U.S.-centric trade, the less leverage Washington has in shaping international economic policy. This shift also poses a challenge for American businesses that have historically relied on the European market. With increased competition from China and Canada, U.S. exporters may struggle to maintain their foothold in Europe. Meanwhile, China is capitalizing on these tensions to expand its reach. China's strategic advantage. China has long positioned itself as a global economic powerhouse, but recent tensions between the United States and its key trading partners have created new opportunities for Beijing to expand its influence. One of China's biggest strategic moves has been strengthening trade ties with Canada and Mexico. As both North American countries seek to reduce their dependence on the United States, China has stepped in as an alternative trade partner, offering investments in infrastructure, technology, and energy projects. China's Belt and Road Initiative has extended its reach into North America, with Chinese firms investing in critical infrastructure projects in Mexico and Canada. This not only deepens economic ties, but also gives China greater influence over regional trade dynamics. The ongoing U.S.-China trade war has accelerated this shift. With U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods remaining in place, Beijing has redirected its exports to markets that are more open to Chinese investment. Canada and Mexico, both eager to diversify their trade relationships, have welcomed Chinese business partnerships, particularly in industries like electric vehicles, renewable energy, and artificial intelligence. Beyond North America, China has also strengthened its influence in Europe. The European Union's increasing economic ties with China, particularly through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, give Beijing a stronger foothold in the global economy. If the United States continues to isolate itself through protectionist policies, China could emerge as the dominant trade partner for many of the world's largest economies. To remain competitive, the United States must rethink its approach to global trade. This could involve renegotiating trade deals to be more favorable to both sides, investing in domestic industries to reduce reliance on imports, and rebuilding trust with economic allies that have been alienated by recent policies. If Washington fails to take action, the consequences could be long-lasting. The rise of independent trade networks, the expansion of China's economic influence, and the gradual decline of U.S. financial dominance could permanently reshape the global economic order. Do you think Canada and other countries are making the right move, or is the U.S. strategy justified? Share your thoughts in the comments below.